father slammed
You
his glass,
loser!
calling me a
Won't
loser
let
living
Lace
off my
Superstar's his
superstar
shadow!
sister. He had no clue that every designer tag she wears her Tesla and even her luxury penthouse
He had no
were paid
idea
for
that every
by
designer
ME
label she
for the
wears,
last
that
3
Tesla
years.
downstairs, even this
The
penthouse,
moment I
was
hit
paid for
cancel
by me for
transfer
the
at
last
that
3
dinner
years.
table,
How
their
dare you,
entire
after
fake
everything we've done
world
for you?
began to burn.
The moment I hit
Saturday
cancel
nights in
transfer,
Greenwich, Connecticut are a
and their
calculated
entire
display
fake
of
world
old
began to
money
burn.
and unyielding expectations.
Saturday nights in Greenwich,
As I
Connecticut,
pulled my dented Ford into the
are a
circular
carefully
driveway of the
curated
Vance
display
estate,
of old
the
money
towering white pillars
and
felt
unyielding
less like a home
expectations.
and more like a fortress built to keep people like
As
me
I
out,
pulled into the
even though
Vance
my last
estate,
name was etched
it
into the
didn't feel like
mailbox.
home. It
Walking
felt
through
like
the
a
mahogany
fortress
front
built to
doors,
keep people
the
like
scent of
me out,
expensive
even though
lilies
my
and
name was
floor
already
wax
written there.
hit me like a physical weight.
The moment I
My
stepped through those
father,
doors,
Harrison Vance,
the
stood by
scent
the
of
fireplace,
expensive
his
lilies
silhouette sharp
and
in a
polished
tailored
floors
suit that probably
hit
cost
me
more
like a
than my
weight.
first warehouse lease. He didn't offer a hug or even a nod. His eyes immediately drifted to my faded hoodie and the smudge of grease on my palm. In this house, if you didn't wear a power tie, you didn't exist. Across the room, my sister Skylar was the center of a small orbit of family friends. She was glowing under the crystal chandelier draped in silk and dripping in Cartier, laughing at a joke I wasn't meant to hear. To them, I was Julian, the black sheep, who spent his days in a gritty Newark warehouse breathing in dust and cardboard. They saw a struggling laborer. They didn't see Skyrec, the e-commerce engine ID built from a single laptop, into a logistics powerhouse. They saw a failure because I didn't have a title on Wall Street. I stood in the shadow of the foyer, feeling the familiar weight of being invisible in the very place I was supposed to belong. I was the ghost in their machine, the silent provider they took for granted while they sipped vintage Bordeaux and discussed the unfortunate trajectory of my life. I adjusted my sleeves, hiding the calluses on my fingers, and prepared to play the role they had written for me one last time. The air in Greenwich always felt thinner, filtered through wealth and filtered through lies. The walls were lined with portraits of ancestors who had built railroads and banks, men who would have looked at me and seen a common worker, not a visionary. My father's disapproval wasn't loud. It was a cold, quiet radiation. It was the way he looked past me when I spoke, or how he sighed when I mentioned the new sorting algorithm we had implemented at the warehouse. To him, if you weren't moving symbols on a screen in a glass tower, you weren't doing real work. He didn't understand the grit of a supply chain or the beauty of a perfectly optimized shipping route. He only understood the prestige of the Vance name, a name I was supposedly tarnishing with my blue-collar ambitions. Skylar, on the other hand, was his masterpiece. She had the Ivy League degree she never used, and the social media following that made her look like a pioneer of the new economy. But looking at her now, swirling a glass of Chardonnay, I saw the cracks. I saw the desperation in her eyes every time her phone pinged. I saw the way she checked the lighting before she smiled for a photo. We were both performing, just on different stages. I was the rugged disappointment, and she was the golden success. The irony was a bitter pill under my tongue. As the guests began to move toward the dining room, the gold-framed mirrors reflected a family that looked perfect from a distance. But I knew the foundation was rotting. I knew that the luxury surrounding us was a thin veneer, and that I was the only thing holding it up. I walked toward the table, the heavy silver clinking against the fine china, a sound that usually meant celebration, but tonight felt like the ticking of a clock. Every step on the polished hardwood felt like a countdown to the moment the facade would finally shatter. I took my seat at the far end of the table, the outsider at my own family's feast, waiting for the first strike. The silence of my Newark office at 2 a.m. is where the truth actually lives. It's a space filled with the hum of server racks and the distant rattle of the PATH train far removed from the manicured lawns of Greenwich. 3 years ago, Skylar had sat in the cracked leather chair across from my desk, her mascara running in dark streaks, her voice a frantic, broken whisper that I can still hear when the warehouse gets too quiet. She had maxed out 6 different credit cards, trying to buy the life she thought she deserved, the life our father expected of us. "Julian, please." She had sobbed, her hands trembling as she clutched a Chanel bag she couldn't afford. "If Dad finds out, I'm $120,000 in debt, and facing an eviction notice from my apartment hell disown me. I'm a Vance Julian. I can't be a failure. I just need a little help to get the brand started just until the big sponsorships kick in. I was a fool back then. I believed in blood over business, and I believed that my success should be a rising tide for everyone in my family. I looked at my sister and saw a girl drowning, not a predator in silk. I didn't see the narcissism hidden behind the tears. I only saw a sibling in need of a lifeline. So I made a deal with the devil. I agreed to a recurring monthly transfer of $7, Zerzo, and a staggering sum that hit Skyrec's cash flow like a sledgehammer. At that time, my company was still in its fragile scaling phase. That $7,000 wasn't just extra money, it was my growth capital. It was the salary of the warehouse manager I desperately needed to hire so I could stop working 20-hour shifts. Because of that transfer, I had to cancel the lease on a new fleet of delivery vans and continue using rusted trucks that broke down every other week on the turnpike. It meant I had to sleep on a thin gray cot in a cramped corner of the warehouse office, breathing in the smell of industrial adhesive and stale coffee just so I could save a few $100s on a personal apartment. I lived like a squatter in my own company. I washed my face in a communal sink and wore the same 3 pairs of jeans until they frayed at the knees. I was a millionaire on paper, but a ghost in reality. For 3 long years, I lived on lukewarm protein bars and bitter espresso, working until my eyes went bloodshot to ensure that $7,000 was in her account by the first of every month. It was a digital wound that never healed a monthly reminder of a debt that wasn't mine. I sacrificed the expansion of Skyrec into the West Coast market, a move that would have doubled our valuation just to keep her from having to explain a declined notification at a brunch in Soho. I bypassed my own salary, entirely living off the bare minimum, while Skylar maintained her influencer lifestyle in a Manhattan penthouse I was secretly funding. I watched my personal bank account drain every month, knowing that my sweat was being converted into her social status. I told myself it was temporary, a bridge to her stability. But the bridge became a permanent highway for her greed. She didn't use the money to pay down her high-interest credit cards or build a sustainable business model with actual inventory. Instead, she used it as a down payment on a Tesla Model S and filled her walk-in closet with orange Hermes boxes that she'd feature in her Get Ready With Me videos. I became the invisible architect of her success, the man who stayed in the dirt so she could stay in the clouds. I was the silent partner in a firm that only produced vanity. Every time I saw her post a self-made queen quote or a video about the hustle of being a young entrepreneur, a part of me turned to stone. I was the one managing a crew of 20, fighting for every cent of margin against global competitors, and dealing with the gritty reality of international logistics, while she spent my life's work on avocado toast and first-class tickets to Tulum for brand research. I was the one working through Thanksgiving and Christmas, the one whose hands were permanently stained with printer ink and palette grease while she took the credit for a legacy I was building with my bare hands. My loyalty wasn't a virtue. It was a cage I had built for myself with golden bars. I was the one paying for the very pedestal our father used to look down on me from. Every dollar I sent her was a bullet she used to shoot down my reputation. I sat in the dark of that Newark warehouse night after night, watching the automated sorters beep and whir, realizing that I wasn't just helping her. I was subsidizing my own erasure. I was the fuel for a fire that was supposed to keep her warm but was slowly burning me alive. I was the only one holding the key to that cage, waiting for the moment when the pain of staying inside finally outweighed the fear of walking out. I was waiting for the one insult, the one lie, or the one betrayal that would finally give me the permission to stop being a martyr and start being a man. The first real crack in my resolve didn't come from the financial strain, but from a screen. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was sitting in my Newark office, the air smelling of ozone and dusty cardboard. Marcus, my head of operations and the only man who knew exactly how thin I was stretching my own pockets, walked in without knocking. He didn't say a word. He just turned his laptop around and pressed play on a video. It was one of Skylar's Life of an Entrepreneur vlogs, filmed in the very penthouse my sweat was paying for. She was leaning back on a white linen sofa, a glass of expensive kombucha in her hand, looking directly into the lens with a look of practiced pity. People always ask how I stay so motivated when I have so much dead weight around me, she told her 2 million followers, her voice dripping with artificial sincerity. Take my brother Julian, for example. He's been struggling with his little shipping business for years. It's hard, you guys, seeing someone you love lack the vision to scale. I've had to step in more times than I can count, giving him startup loans just to keep his lights on. But that's what family does. We carry the ones who can't run as fast as we do. I felt the blood drained from my face, replaced by a heat so intense it made my ears ring. Marcus closed the laptop with a sharp click. Julian, she's not just taking your money anymore, he said, his voice low and dangerous. She's weaponizing your silence to build a narrative where you're the charity case. She's using your $7,000 a month to buy the megaphone she's using to scream that you're a failure. I looked down at my hand stained with the ink of shipping labels and scarred from pallet splinters, and then at the high-end spreadsheet Marcus had open on his second monitor. The numbers were a nightmare of indulgence. Marcus had done what I was too afraid to do. He'd tracked where my emergency loans were actually going. Skylar hadn't paid a single cent toward her $120,000 credit card debt in over 6 months. Instead, the $7,000 ID sent her last month had been split almost exactly between a deposit for a private jet charter to Coachella and a pair of limited edition vanity sneakers. While I was skipping meals to ensure our delivery drivers got their bonuses, she was using my survival capital to buy clout. The betrayal felt like a physical weight in my chest, a cold realization that my loyalty was being treated as an infinite resource. I had spent years convinced that if I just worked harder, if I just carried her a little further, she would eventually find her footing and we could be a family again. But Skylar didn't want a footing. She wanted a throne, and she didn't care if my back broke, serving as the foundation. Marcus leaned over the desk, his eyes locking onto mine. How much longer, Julian? How much of Skyrek are you willing to let her burn before you realize she's the one holding the match? I didn't answer him right away. I looked out the window at the Newark skyline, the gritty industrial lights flickering in the haze. For years, I had let the Vance name and my father's expectations dictate my silence. I had let myself believe that being the responsible one meant being the one who suffered in secret. But looking at the empty protein bar wrappers on my desk and the cot in the corner, I realized I wasn't being responsible. I was being an enabler. I was funding the very lies that were burying my reputation. She thinks I'm dead weight. I whispered the words, tasting like ash. I pulled up my banking app and looked at the recurring transfer scheduled for the 1st of the month. It sat there like a ticking clock, a silent promise I had made to a girl who no longer existed. Skylar had replaced the sister I knew with a curated hollow brand, and she was using my life's work to polish it. The eating resentment, that deep choking resentment that I had been suppressing for 3 years, finally began to boil over. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the truth. If Skylar wanted to tell the world a story about who was supporting whom, then I was going to make sure the ending was one she never saw coming. I told Marcus to keep the spreadsheets ready. The next family dinner in Greenwich was only 4 days away, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going there to hide. I was going there to settle the tab. The following afternoon, I returned to the Newark warehouse with a hollow ache in my chest that no amount of work could drown out. I was standing near the loading dock watching a shipment of ultralight titanium stoves being palletized when Marcus signaled me from the glass-walled office. His face was devoid of its usual stoic composure. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a hit and run. Without saying a word, he pointed to a secondary laptop he used for monitoring market competitors and social sentiment. I set up a digital footprint alert for Skyrek's internal data architecture last month, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. Something tripped the wire. Someone wasn't just looking at our public site. They were inside our backend accessing the proprietary vendor list and our 12-month customer retention strategy. I felt a cold sweat prickle my neck. Skyrex's secret wasn't just the gear. It was the hyper-optimized logistics network and the direct-to-manufacturer relationships I had spent 5 years bleeding for. I leaned in, scrolling through the access logs. The IP address was masked, but the login credentials used were a legacy set ID created for Skylar years ago when I thought she might actually help me with the business. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I followed the trail to a series of outgoing emails. Skylar hadn't just been researching. She was in the middle of a secret negotiation with Apex Outdoors, our largest corporate rival. She was offering them a consultancy package, which was really just a fancy term for Skyrex's confidential supplier list and our Q4 marketing roadmap. In exchange, Apex was offering her a $200,000 contract to be the global face of adventure luxury. She was selling the very marrow of my company to buy a bigger spotlight for herself. The air in the office suddenly felt too thin to breathe. This wasn't just indulgence or vanity anymore. This was an execution. She was willing to bankrupt me, put my 20 employees out of work, and dismantle my life's work just to secure a single contract that would keep her relevant for another season. The $7,000 I sent her every month was effectively funding the legal fees and the lifestyle she needed to maintain while she planned my downfall. I slumped into my chair, the flickering fluorescent lights above reflecting off the stacks of invoices on my desk. I realized then that I had been a character in a story I didn't write. In Skylar's world, I wasn't her brother. I was a resource to be mined until dry and then discarded. The deep-seated loyalty that had kept me silent for 3 years didn't just crack, it shattered completely. "Julian," Marcus said, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "She's not just a spoiled sister anymore. She's an existential threat. If you don't move now, there won't be a Skyrex by Christmas." I didn't blink. I stared at the screen, watching the cursor blink like a heartbeat. The betrayal was so absolute it was almost clarifying. All the guilt I'd felt about potentially embarrassing her, all the older brother instincts to protect her from our father's wrath, they evaporated. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a backup drive containing every bank statement, every panicked text message she'd sent begging for cash, and the logged IP data of her digital theft. I looked at Marcus, my eyes cold and focused. "She thinks she's playing a game of brand management," I said, my voice sounding foreign even to me. "But she forgot that I'm the one who built the platform she's standing on." The plan for the Greenwich dinner began to shift. It was no longer about just stopping the money. It was about an unconditional surrender. I spent the next 4 hours meticulously cross-referencing her self-made claims against my transfer receipts. I compiled the evidence of her attempted corporate espionage into a single devastating file. As I worked, I felt a strange icy calm settle over me. For years, I had allowed her to define me as the struggling brother. I had accepted the hoodie, the grease, and the silence. But Skylar had made a fatal mistake. She assumed that because I was quiet, I was weak. She assumed that my love for my family was a blind spot she could exploit forever. By midnight, the file was complete. I closed my laptop and looked out at the dark warehouse floor. The automated sorters were still whirring their rhythmic beeps, sounding like a countdown. I wasn't just going to Greenwich to settle a tab. I was going there to reclaim my name. Skylar wanted to be the face of adventure luxury. I was going to give her an adventure she'd never forget, one that started with the truth and ended with her finally, for the first time in her life, having to earn her own way. The superstar was about to meet the man who had been holding the flashlight, and I was seconds away from turning it off. The drive to Greenwich felt like a funeral procession for a version of myself I was finally ready to bury. The Vance estate was ablaze with light, every window of the colonial mansion glowing with a predatory warmth. Valets in white gloves whisked away black SUVs, and the air hummed with the refined murmur of Wall Street's elite. Tonight wasn't just a family dinner, it was a coronation. Harrison had invited his inner circleman with silver hair and hearts made of stone to witness Skylar's ascension as she prepared to announce her new deal with Apex Outdoors. As I stepped into the dining room, the clinking of crystal and the scent of prime rib felt suffocating. Harrison sat at the head of the table, presiding over the room like a king. He looked at me as I entered, his gaze lingering on my clean but simple black button-down. "Julian," he said, his voice a cool blade of disappointment. "Glad you could make it away from the shipping crates for one night. Try not to mention the warehouse during the soup course. Our guests prefer to discuss growth, not manual labor." A ripple of polite, cruel laughter went around the table. I took my seat in silence, my eyes locking onto Skylar. She was radiant in a silk dress that cost more than my first delivery truck, her neck adorned with a diamond pendant that caught the chandelier light. She gave me a tight, triumphant smile, the look of a woman who believed she had already won. Beside Harrison's plate, I noticed the gold Rolex he had worn for 30 years, the Vance Legacy watch. But as he adjusted his cuff, the light hit the dial differently. My eyes narrowed. I had spent years studying materials and manufacturing for Skyrek gear. The bezel was slightly off-kilter. The weight of the metal didn't pull on his skin the way 18K gold should. It was a replica, a high-end fake. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My father, the great Harrison Vance, was wearing a lie on his wrist to match the lies sitting at his table. "To Skylar," Harrison announced, raising a glass of $500 Cabernet. A true Vance, self-reliant visionary and a leader of her generation. She has shown us all that with enough grit, you don't need anyone's help to reach the top. She's the daughter every father dreams of successful because she earned it. He tipped the glass toward me, his lip curling in a subtle sneer. Unlike some who seem content to stay in the mud, Skylar understands that a name is a responsibility, not a crutch. The guests raised their glasses, the room filling with the sound of cheers and well-deserved. Skylar leaned back, her face a mask of practiced humility. "Thank you, Dad," she said, her voice projecting to the back of the room. "It's been a long road, and I've had to carry a lot on my shoulders, especially supporting those close to me who couldn't find their own way. But that's the burden of success, isn't it?" I felt the receipt in my pocket, the $2.500 luxury boutique charge from 3 days ago, and the digital folder on my phone containing the $250,000 in transfers. The eating resentment, the suffocating resentment, was no longer a fire. It was a cold, calculated engine. I watched Skylar laugh, watched my father preen, and watched the Wall Street vultures nod in approval of a fiction I had funded. The main course arrived, but the air remained thick with the smell of my father's arrogance. He began telling a story about the Vance work ethic, using me as the foil once again. He spoke about how I lacked the killer instinct, and how I'd be nothing without the family safety net I was actually the one weaving. I looked at the men around the table, the supposed titans of industry, and realized they were all being conned by a girl with a ring light and an old man with a fake watch. I checked my watch, my real steel-cased work watch. It was time. The adventure luxury Skylar was about to sell to Apex was built on the bones of my company, and Harrison's pride was built on a bank account that was rapidly approaching zero. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt a strange sense of duty, not to them, but to the truth. The crystal glasses stood in a row like soldiers, thin and fragile. I knew that with just one word I could make them all shatter. I waited for the server to clear the plates, my thumb hovering over the send button on a pre-drafted email to every person at this table. The crown was about to slip, and I was the only one who knew how far the fall would be. The silence following my father's toast was heavy thick with the self-congratulatory smirks of men who measured human worth by zip codes and offshore accounts. I pushed my chair back slowly, the screech of wood against the polished marble floor cutting through the room like a tactical siren. The conversation died instantly. Harrison looked at me, his brow furrowed in a mixture of annoyance and habitual disdain. "Julian," he said, his voice a low warning, "if you're going to use the restroom, do it quietly." Skylar is about to share her Q4 projections for her upcoming global partnership with Apex Outdoors. This is a moment for real business, not warehouse breaks. "Actually, Dad," I said, my voice projecting with a steady, haunting clarity that seemed to vibrate the crystal stemware on the table. "I think we should talk about projections right now. Specifically, the projection of a lifestyle that has never actually existed. We've spent enough time celebrating a mirage, and I think these gentlemen deserve to see the actual balance sheet." Skylar's camera-ready smile didn't just fade, it curdled into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Her hand tightened around her wineglass until her knuckles went white. "Julian, stop. You're embarrassing yourself. You've clearly had too much to drink or you're just bitter. Sit down before you ruin this for everyone." "Am I?" I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped a command I had preset before I even walked through those mahogany doors. I synced the device to the 85-inch 4K display Harrison used for his market updates at the head of the table. The screen flickered to life, and for a second the only sound was the soft hum of the electronics. Then it displayed a massive, cold, and undeniable spreadsheet. "This is a record of 36 months of recurring bank transfers." I began walking toward the screen. "From my personal account at Skyrec to yours, Skylar. $7,000 on the first of every single month, totaling over $250,000 in 3 years. That self-made penthouse in Manhattan you feature in your vlogs, I paid the rent. That Tesla you claimed you hustled for, I paid the lease. Every designer bag, every first-class flight to Tulum, every single cent of your independence was subsidized by the warehouse grease and the 18-hour shifts you so despise. You weren't building a brand, Skylar. You were building a bill that I was forced to foot while you played entrepreneur for the cameras." A collective gasp swept the room. One of the Wall Street guests, a man who had spent 40 years sniffing out fraud, leaned forward, squinting at the screen with the predatory interest of a shark sensing blood. Harrison's face turned a dangerous mottled shade of purple, his veins bulging at his temples like coiled snakes. "What is this nonsense, Skylar? Tell him he's lying. Tell these people this is some pathetic fabrication born out of jealousy." Skylar opened her mouth, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. Her eyes were fixed on the line item state's precise amounts and the desperate, pathetic memo lines she had sent me during her late-night panics. "Please, Julian, just 1 more month. And don't tell Dad I'll pay you back when the Apex deal closes." The room felt like a vacuum, the air sucked out by the sudden, violent intrusion of reality. But that's not the best part. I continued my thumb swiping to the next file, which displayed internal server logs and masked IP addresses. This is a log of Skylar using her legacy credentials to hack into Skyrec's backend. She wasn't just taking my money, she was trying to steal my proprietary vendor list and my Q4 marketing roadmap to sell them to Apex Outdoors as her own strategic insight. She was trying to bankrupt her own brother to buy herself 1 more season of relevance. I walked to the head of the table, standing directly over my father. The room was so quiet I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. I reached down and grabbed Harrison's wrist, the one wearing the legendary Vance gold Rolex. I lifted it for the entire room to see. "And you, Dad, you spent the last hour talking about real work and the Vance legacy. You used me as the foil to her success. But look at this bezel. Look at the way the light hits the dial. This watch is a replica, a $200 fake. You're wearing a lie on your wrist to match the lies sitting at your table. Your daughter is a fraud, and your own prestige is built on a foundation of sand. You were so busy looking down at my hoodie that you didn't notice your golden child was picking your pocket and mine at the same time." I turned back to the screen and hit the cancel button on my banking app. The chime that confirmed the termination of the recurring transfer sounded through the silent room like a gunshot. The transfers stopped tonight. The Manhattan penthouse lease is in my name, and I've already filed the paperwork to terminate it effective immediately. You have 48 hours to pack your bags, Skylar. Since you're such a self-made queen, I'm sure you'll have no problem finding a way to pay your own way from now on. Maybe Apex will still want to hire you once they see the cease and desist letter my lawyers just sent them regarding my stolen data." The room erupted. Not into shouting, but into a low, frantic murmur of redirected allegiances. The guests began to stand, avoiding eye contact with Harrison. Skylar's composure finally completely shattered. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob the ugly, loud sounds of a child who had finally been told no after a lifetime of yes. Harrison slumped in his chair, the weight of the fake watch seemingly dragging his arm down into the wine-stained tablecloth. He looked old. He looked defeated. "The real entrepreneur at this table," I said, looking directly at the representative from Apex Outdoors, who was already deleting Skylar's contact from his phone, "is the one who built the company you were trying to scavenge. Skyrek isn't a little shipping business. It's a $1 million logistics engine that just stopped being a charity for people who don't know the value of a dollar they didn't earn." I didn't wait for a rebuttal. I didn't need one. I had spent 3 years carrying their weight, allowing them to define me by my silence. The second I let go, the gravity of their own deceptions did the rest of the work. I walked out of the mansion, the cool, honest Greenwich air hitting my face like a blessing. Behind me, the house of cards was falling in total silence, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to turn back and catch the pieces. I was Julian Vance, and I was finally, truly free. The aftermath of the Greenwich explosion didn't result in a shouting match. It resulted in a chilling, expensive silence. By the time I reached the Newark warehouse, the sun was beginning to bleed over the Manhattan skyline, turning the steel towers into needles of light. I didn't go to my cot. I went to my desk, opened my laptop, and watched the real-time analytics of Skyrek. For the first time in 3 years, the numbers felt pure. There was no $7,000 ghost limb dragging down our margins. Every cent we earned now belonged to the people who actually moved the boxes. 2 days later, the second twist I hadn't expected arrived in the form of a certified letter. It wasn't from Skylar's lawyers, but from a private restructuring firm. As I dug into the legal filings, the Vance legacy finally revealed its true face. Harrison Vance wasn't just wearing a fake watch. He was presiding over a fake empire. He had lost the bulk of the family trust in a series of disastrous, over-leveraged bets on commercial real estate 4 years ago. The Greenwich estate was mortgaged to the hilt, and he had been using Skylar's influencer persona as a front to secure private loans from his Wall Street friends, promising them early-stage access to her supposedly booming digital ventures. He hadn't just been proud of Skylar, he had been hiding behind her. He needed her to look successful so the creditors wouldn't come knocking at the mansion doors. My sister wasn't just a spoiled narcissist. She was the getaway driver for our father's pride. A week later, Skylar showed up at the warehouse. There were no cameras, no ring lights, and no silk dresses. She was wearing an old tracksuit, her hair pulled back in a messy knot, looking like a woman who had finally run out of road. She stood in the middle of the loading dock, flinching at the sound of the pneumatic tape guns and the shouting of the floor crew. "Julian," she said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the conveyor belts. "The bank froze Dad's accounts. They're taking the house. I have nowhere to go. My followers, they've turned. The Apex deal is dead, and my comments are full of people calling me a fraud. I'm broke, Julian. For real this time." I looked at her from the mezzanine, the railing cold under my hands. "You aren't broke, Skylar. You're just at zero. There's a difference." "Please," she whispered, looking up at me. "Just a loan, to get a studio, to start over." "No more loans," I said, and the words didn't feel like revenge. They felt like medicine. "But Marcus needs a lead for the customer service night shift. It pays $22 an hour. There's a cubicle with your name on it if you're willing to actually work for a Vance paycheck." She looked at the grimy warehouse floor, then back at me, the reality of a 40-hour work week settling into her eyes. She didn't take the job knot that day. She walked away, disappearing into the industrial gray of Newark, but the seed was planted. Harrison, on the other hand, disappeared into a small rental in Florida, refusing to speak to either of us. His pride was the only thing he had left, and it was a cold companion. Skywreck, freed from the parasitic drain of the Vance facade, exploded. With the retained capital, we finally opened the West Coast hub in Reno. Marcus took over as COO, and Elena Sterling, the investor who had watched me dismantle the dinner table put in $10 million, not because of my name, but because she'd seen the raw data of a man who could protect his company at all costs. 6 months later, I was leaving the office late when I saw a light on in the packing department. A lone figure was standing at a station, meticulously folding a titanium stove into its protective casing, ensuring the shipping label was perfectly centered. It was Skylar. She had come back 3 weeks prior, took the entry-level job, and hadn't posted a single photo to Instagram since. She looked tired, her hands were stained with ink, and she was wearing a Skywreck hoodie. She didn't see me. She just kept working, moving one box at a time, building something that didn't require a filter to look real. I realized then that breaking the glass hadn't just saved my company, it had given my sister the only chance she ever had at being a human being instead of a brand. I walked out to my car, the Newark air smelling of salt and hard work, and for the first time in my life I wasn't the disappointment or the provider. I was just Julian, and that was more than enough.